Chapter 13 Religion. Ouspensky's attitude to G's teaching was primarily that of the scientist and the philosopher, and he required of us that we should avoid mixing religious terms with what was called the language of the system. For example, when speaking of the ray of creation, we must not substitute the religious term God for the philosophical word absolute, however tempted we might be to do so. And Ouspensky was right in maintaining the purity of the system's language, for it was an excellent instrument for the expression of our thoughts. Adulterating with terms derived from other systems of knowledge would have ended in lack of precision and confusion of thought. But the relationship between G's teachings of a frankly religious nature was so close that even when we were using system language, our thoughts were often running in a religious direction. Whether we liked it or not, the psychological ideas of the system had revived in our minds memories of the sayings of Christ and of Buddha, and Madame Ouspensky increased this tendency of our thoughts to become deflected in a religious direction by organizing readings during the weekends from the various sacred books of the world. For a month or so, we would be listening at the country headquarters of the work at Line to a translation she had made from the Philokalia, that Russian collection of the writings of the early Christian fathers, and we would be astonished at the psychological insight shown by those early Christians into the various stages in the deepening of identification. Then, as a relief from the austerities of the desert monks, we would be enjoying the sermons of the truly gentle and infinitely compassionate Gautama Buddha, and would be discovering how striking were the similarities between his words and the ideas we were studying during the rest of the week. Next might come readings from the fascinating collection of stories to be found in that work of Sufi genius, the Mathnawi of Jalala Uddin Rumi, stories which made us laugh at our own weaknesses and which were almost identical with those displayed by the absurd characters portrayed in the book. Readings from Lao Tzu and the Tao were also included in this symposium of Sunday readings, and more forcibly there was driven home for us the underlying unity of all the great world faiths. It was out of the readings of Gautama Buddha that there was born in me that interest which has increased in me ever since, my interest in the ancient traditional literature of India, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and that sublime commentary on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, have become for me the greatest of the world's literary possessions, of equal standing to the Christian Gospels, and from this in turn has come the conviction that wherever we happen to be looking, we are all searching for the same eternal truth, that truth in the light of which all other forms of knowledge will fall into place and reveal their secrets to us. But what we usually fail to realize is that though the truths we are seeking is eternal. But what we usually fail to realize is that though the truth we are seeking is eternal and unchanging, it has to find expression in time and through the medium of man's mind, and this in turn entails that it is expressed in many different ways. Consequently, the world's sacred writings can be regarded as made up of two elements, the one eternal and unchanging, and the other temporary, perishable, and dependent on the period and the place in which the eternal element is finding its expression. It is only the vehicle in which truth is being presented which varies. The eternal essence of the great religions is always the same, nor is it only the relationship between the various religions which has been made clearer to me by G's teaching, but also the relationship existing between his teaching and that of the way of the monk. G has never revealed to any of us the source of his knowledge, but has spoken only rather vaguely of certain world brotherhoods and monasteries in the heart of Asia which he had visited in the company of others. He has also referred frequently to a band of seekers of the truth, which met again and again which met again after their wanderings for the express purpose of putting together their findings in a form suitable for Western consumption. And what could be better fitted to the present needs of Western man, living as he now does in a scientific age, than the system of knowledge with which G returned after this meeting to Russia, and which he taught to his Moscow and St. Petersburg groups. It was a system particularly well suited to the needs of the present day. All dog-eared theological doctrines had been removed from it, and it wore instead the reassuring trappings of materialism, but of a materialism which on closer examination proved to be utterly different from that of science. Another great advantage of the system was that it was so unlike institutional religion that not even the most rabid reactionary to orthodox religions could be offended by it, and yet from its depths came gleams of the same eternal truths which glow through the external trappings of religion. No better vehicle for the presentation of them to a religion-shy Western world could have been chosen than that which was devised by G and his fellow seekers. I had never reacted strongly against Orthodox Christianity, as some of my companions had done, but the terms used by religion had become so bedraggled and unsightly that I hesitated to make any further use of them. I uttered the word God on those very rare occasions, or when it was necessary to use, awkwardly and with overtones of apology, for it conjured up in my mind old Sunday school pictures of an angry old Jewish sheik wearing a long beard similar to those worn by his myrmidons, Moses and his brother Aaron. Still worse has fared the word for that emotion which is the very lifeblood of all the religions, the word love, bawled from a million pulpits, lavishly crooned through millions of loud speakers. It has become an outrage to good taste and decent feeling. I share Aldous Huxley's feelings about this mangled word love, and for many years I have avoided using it. But here in G's system was a means of expressing ideas which I knew to be true without making use of these ill-treated words, and for me, therefore, G has acted not only as a fount of wisdom, but as the means of bringing me back after a long absence to religion. The conclusion which I had long ago reached, that G was of a much more religious nature than Ouspensky, was confirmed many years later when I met the former in Paris. It was true that G occasionally made disparaging remarks about priests, but when he did this he criticized the priests for their failings and not for their calling. Of the great religious leaders themselves he spoke always with reverence, calling them the divine messengers of God. So also did he make freer use than Ouspensky had done of the concepts, practice, and symbols of religion. There are two great errors, he said, in the popular view of religion. The first error is the failure of men to realize that a religion consists of doing and not of thinking. Consists in doing and not in thinking. A man must live his religion as fully as is within his power to live it, for otherwise his religion is only a fantasy or a philosophy. Whether we like it or not, we reveal our religion by our actions, and this is the only way in which we are able to reveal it. The second error lies in man's failure to understand that his religion will depend on his level of being, and that the form of religion which suits him best is not necessarily the form most suited to the needs of another person." End quote. Hence the complete failure of mankind to agree about the outward trappings of religion. Two examples will be sufficient to show how G's teaching explained much in the Gospels which had previously meant little or nothing to me, the first being the idea of death and rebirth. A belief in the necessity for rebirth is common to all the great world faiths, and it is the origin of the Indian term, the twice born. It is in the account of Nicodemus's secret visit to Christ that this subject is dealt with most clearly in the Gospels. Christ said to Nicodemus, quote, "Unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." And Nicodemus, being a number 3 man who took everything literally, was amazed at such a statement. Not that Nicodemus is the only person who has found this saying a difficult one, for to understand what is meant by it, the idea of rebirth has to be linked with 2 other ideas, those of awakening and of dying to oneself. Dr. Maurice Nicoll writes of these 3 closely allied ideas as follows, quote, "When a man awakes, he can die. When he dies, he can be born. To awake, to die, to be born. These are 3 successive stages. If you study the Gospels attentively, you will see that references are often made to the possibility of being born. Several references are made to the necessity of dying, and there are very many references to the necessity of awakening." This is from Maurice Nicoll, Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Uspensky, Volume 1. To awake to oneself and to see the 1,000 petty identifications which enslave one is the first requirement. To die to this multitude of identifications and also to the many false eyes created by the imagination is the second requirement. To be born again is the third, and, in the words of G's system, being born again entails the growth of essence in the formation of a real and permanent I. This doctrine of death and rebirth in a new form was part of a teaching which existed long before Christ's coming. There are good reasons for believing that the initiates at the mystery ceremonies which were performed both at Eleusis and on the island of Philae in the river Nile symbolized the idea of death and rebirth by carrying in their hands grains of wheat. These seeds had to be cast on the ground where, to all intents and purposes, they died as seeds before it was possible for them to be reborn into a new world in the new form of green and vigorous shoots. The second religious subject on which G's teaching threw light for me was that of prayer. Before meeting the work, it seemed to me that prayer was little more than a petitioning of the Almighty for favors to which one was not in any wise entitled. It was therefore with particular interest that I awaited Uspensky's answer to the question, "Are prayers ever answered?" Instead of returning, as I had expected, a plain yes or no, he replied, "It depends on the prayer. G taught us that we must learn to pray just as we must learn to do everything else. Most prayers are merely requests that 2 and 2 shall make 5, instead of adding up, as usual, to 4. In other words, that a man's action shall not reap the customary result." But Uspensky added, "Whoever knows how to pray and to keep his attention on his prayer, that man has obtained what he has asked for." Maurice Nicoll helps us to understand the nature and the function of prayer from the point of view of G's teaching. In The New Man, he writes that the Gospels teach us that in the spiritual and invisible world there exist higher and lower levels which are distinct from one another and are arranged in the order of above and below. The lower is not in direct touch with the higher, and the ground floor is not in direct touch with the top floor. And so, to reach what is above, many difficulties stand in the way, which makes it look as if there were reluctance on the part of the higher level to respond to the lower. It is not a question of reluctance. A man's prayer, his aim, his request must be persisted in. It must go on in spite of not being answered. As Christ says, quote, "He must pray continually and not faint." To pray, to enter into touch with a higher level, a man must know and feel he is nothing in comparison with what is above him. Nicoll also makes an interesting comment on the very exact instructions given by Christ to his disciples on how to pray. Quote, "But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thine inner chamber, and having shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall recompense thee." End quote. From Matthew chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. According to Nicoll, to enter into thine inner chamber and shut the door is to go into the innermost room of one's being, and, having closed the door to all distractions, to pray from that small innermost place in oneself, which is the sole part of one capable of either communicating with something on a higher level or of receiving anything from it. The external, worldly side of a man, the pretending part of a man, the part which is usually present in him, is quite unable to pray. But a theoretical difficulty stands in the way of receiving help from the highest level. In describing the ray of creation, Ouspensky pointed out that it was impossible for the Absolute to interfere with events happening on a lower level, without destroying all the machinery intervening between itself and that lower level. How, therefore, can there be any direct response from above to prayer coming from so far below as the earth? This difficulty no longer troubles me, for I do not expect to establish contact, when I pray, with an intelligence so exalted as that of the Supreme Being, nor do I feel that this is in any way necessary to me. It is enough to know that in this universe there exists a whole hierarchy of higher beings with whom it is occasionally possible to commune, and when this sublime event has taken place, when I have actually succeeded in drawing nearer to an intelligence on a higher level than myself, then my prayer has been answered. G said that one must know how to pray, and Jacob Boehme tells us in The Signature of All Things how to approach prayer. His instructions are given in the form of a conversation between a disciple and his master. Quote, "Sir, how may I come to this supersensual life, so that I may see God and may hear God speaking?" inquires the disciple. The master answered and said, quote, "Son, when thou canst throw thyself into that where no creature dwelleth, though it be for a moment, then thou hearest what God speaketh." Disciple, is that where no creature dwelleth near at hand, or is it far off? Master, it is in thee. And if thou canst, my son, for a while but cease from all thy thinking and willing, then thou shalt hear the unspeakable words of God. Disciple, how can I hear him speak when I stand still from thinking and willing? Master, when thou standest still from thee thinking of self and the willing of self, when both thy intellect and will are quiet and passive to the impression of the eternal Word and Spirit, and when thy soul is winged up and above that which is temporal, the outward senses and the imagination being locked up by holy abstraction, then the eternal hearing, speaking, and seeing will be revealed in thee. End quote. If any doubt lingers as to the necessity for stopping self-thinking and self-willing when trying to pray, it will be dispelled by the support given to this by Meister Eckhart. The most powerful prayer, one well nigh omnipotent and the worthiest work of all, is the outcome of a quiet mind. The quieter it is, the more powerful, the worthier, the deeper, the more telling and more perfect the prayer is. To the quiet mind all things are possible. What is a quiet mind? A quiet mind is one which nothing weighs or worries, which, free from ties and all self-seeking, is wholly merged into the will of God and dead as to its own. End quote. This is from the works of Meister Eckhart, translated by C. D.B. Evans. G advances a novel and interesting religious idea in his book All and Everything, which can be called the theory of the buried conscience. He writes that at one time man was in direct communication with higher levels of thought and feeling, thanks to his possession at that time of a real and objective conscience, but that now he has lost touch with everything above him. His loss of contact with higher levels is in great part due to the fact that his objective conscience has become submerged in the subconscious region of his mind, so that it no longer exerts any influence on his everyday life. As a substitute for his buried conscience, he has developed an artificial and subjective conscience, which has prescribed different codes of behavior in different periods of history and in different parts of the world. But if man is to develop, he must manage to awaken the real conscience which is asleep within him, and to awaken is very difficult and has to be done in stages. All work, including this awakening of conscience, begins in intellectual center with the acquirement of new attitudes and modes of thought, but the emotional part of intellectual center is far too weak to be able to counteract the unruly emotional center, and it is doubtful whether this task of awakening conscience could be achieved were it not for the fact that real conscience lies close to higher emotional center, which now begins to lend its more powerful aid. In speaking to his original Russian groups, G once said that every real religion consisted of two parts. One part taught what had to be done. This part became common knowledge and in course of time was distorted and altered from its original form. The other part taught how to do what the first part laid down. This part was perceived in secret in special schools, and with its help it was always possible to rectify what had been distorted in the first part and to restore what had been forgotten. This secret part existed in Christianity as well as in other religions, and it taught us how to carry out the precepts of Christ and what they really meant. From the above, it is possible to gather what was G's own attitude to Christianity, and if any doubt still lingers on this subject, it is dispelled by the answer he gave to someone who put the following question to him: "What is the relationship of the teaching you are expounding to Christianity as we know it?" To this he replied, quote, "I do not know what you know about Christianity. It would be necessary to talk a great deal and for a long time in order to make clear what you understand by this term. But for the benefit of those who know already, I will say that, if you like, this is esoteric Christianity." End quote. Some readers may resent the very idea that there exists such a thing as esoteric Christianity. It has often been said that Christianity possesses no secrets at all, and that its message is there for all humanity to accept or reject. I have even heard it said that the Gospels are simple books which are comprehensible to everybody. To those who think in this way, the idea that there once existed such things as the Christian mysteries will be repellent, yet the term "the mysteries of Jesus" was a very familiar one to Christians living in the first 2 centuries. Many of the ceremonies and forms of worship used at that time in the Christian church were ceremonies and rituals which had been taken over from what would now be called paganism. The early Christian church was a great borrower, and ancient Egypt contributed a great deal to its services. Religion in Egypt was always linked with the mysteries, and the idea that Christianity is a simple religion, comprehensible to the lowest level of intelligence, is a comparatively modern idea. An idea which was encouraged by the Protestants at the time of the Reformation, but the early Christian fathers held an entirely different view of Christianity. Saint Clement of Alexandria had no doubts that there existed a hidden side of Christianity, as well as the side which was open to the public, and he spoke with considerable heat on this subject. After referring to the Christian mysteries, he said, "Even now I fear, as it is said, to cast the pearls before swine, lest they tread them under foot and turn and rend us, for it is difficult to exhibit the really pure and transparent words respecting the true light to swinish and untrained hearers." During 1949, readings of the manuscript of G's book, All and Everything, were held in his Paris flat, and some of us were told that special importance was laid by G on the chapters which described the mission of the divine messenger Ashiata Shiyamash to the planet Earth. It was said, and I believe with truth, that G recognized a close relationship between the methods he was employing and those used by Ashiata Shiyamash. In All and Everything, G describes how before starting his mission to mankind, Ashiata Shiyamash meditated for 40 days on the form which his message should take. In the end, he decided that the inhabitants of Earth so badly misunderstood now the real nature of faith, love, and hope, the three great principles which had been used by all former religious teachers, that it would be quite useless for him to employ them again. But fortunately, something real and unspoilt still survived in man's unconscious, namely the sacred being impulse conscience. And it had remained intact thanks to the very fact that it lay very deeply buried in man's unconscious, protected from wrong thinking and wrong feeling. It was therefore to man's buried conscience that Ashiata Shamash made his appeal, with the result that in many of his hearers this sacred being impulse was awakened and began to participate in that consciousness of theirs by means of which their waking existence flows. From G. Gurdjieff, All and Everything. Humanity is now in a critical situation with regard to religion. All religions are based on the belief that the individual is all important, but this doctrine is now being challenged by two giant world powers who are asserting that the reverse of this is true, and that the individual exists only for the sake of the community, as the ant exists only for the sake of the ant heap, and the bee only for the sake of the beehive. Here is a doctrine incompatible with all religious beliefs other than those of the pseudo-religion of communism, which proclaims it, and it is a doctrine which is spreading at the moment when a great historian is assuring us that the outlook for the Western powers is poor unless there be a spiritual revival. According to Arnold Toynbee, this alone is capable of resolving our difficulties and of uniting the nations of the world. Now, if we agree with this historian's verdict, we must also agree with him that it is highly unlikely that the world will ever be conquered and united under any one of the great religious faiths, whether that faith be Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism. This hope, once widely held by Christians and by Muslims, has now to be abandoned. But this does not preclude the possibility of a religious resurgence of another kind, for religions, in the wider sense in which Arnold Toynbee is using that word, can take many forms, and it would be a mistake to regard a spread of one of the old world faiths as the only possible remedy for our present ills. G taught that there are several roads to human evolution. There are men for whom the way of the monk would appear to be an unsuitable path to perfection, a possibility which has been more widely recognized in the East than in the West. It is for this reason that different kinds of yoga have been provided for different types of men. For the religious type, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, or the yoga of knowledge for the philosophical type of man, karma yoga for the active type, and raja yoga for the contemplative type. All of these are recognized as ways to perfection. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna promises that whatever the way chosen, provided it be pursued with devotion and sincerity, it will lead in the end to the same goal. If you cannot become absorbed in me, then devote yourself to works which will please me, for by working for my sake only you will achieve perfection. If you cannot even do this, then surrender yourself to me altogether, control the lusts of your heart, and renounce the fruits of every action. In this manner does Krishna counsel Arjuna. It will have been noted that there exist elements from all of these different kinds of yoga in the method of development described in this book, and the emphasis placed on each of these elements will vary in accordance with the type of the person concerned. No reader approaches this or any other book with an open mind, but with a mind which has previously been subjected to many years of conditioning. His reaction to Gurdjieff's teaching will depend, therefore, not on the impression of the moment, but on a host of factors in his past conditioning. It will depend, amongst other things, on his nationality, on whether he be a Westerner or an Oriental, on his education, on his upbringing, and on 1,001 influences to which he has previously been exposed. How can a mind which has undergone so much previous conditioning look upon anything afresh and without bias? It is obviously impossible for any of us to view what we read otherwise than through a medium of past beliefs, ideals, and experiences. Nor can an intellectual acceptance of certain new ideals, however noble they be, have any radical or lasting effect on a person. Ideals exist only in the mind, and to add a few new ones to those we have already collected is only to continue the line of our thinking from the past into the future. All that is really happening is that a new suit of clothes is being put on to the wearer of the same old body and of the same old face. To bring about any radical and lasting change in ourselves, something far more revolutionary is required than these surface additions. We are imprisoned within our own minds, and however far we extend them, and however highly we decorate them, we still remain within their walls. If we are ever to escape from our prisons, the first step must be that we should realize our true situation, and at the same time see ourselves as we really are, and not as we imagine ourselves to be. This can be done by holding ourselves in a state of passive awareness, a state in which the limitation of the mind and of the impression self are both seen and felt to the fullest. But here, at this point, we have to be on our guard, probably the first time in our lives, we catch sight of our own pettiness, our vanity, our egoism, our indifference to others, and our greed. We rush forward to explain, to judge, to condemn, or to excuse the things which have been exposed, and thus we become immediately identified with them. Such mechanical reactions as these must be quietly but firmly pushed aside, for it is only when we have ceased either to condemn or to justify, and are able to accept as ourselves all we have seen, it is only then that something on a higher level may appear. If we can manage to acknowledge ourselves in our entirety without any comment and without even naming what has been seen, then an unaccustomed stillness may descend on us, in which the narrow self of everyday life is completely transcended and the walls of our prison disappear. It is at this moment of inner quietness, of newly revealed freedom, of heightened being, that something of a much more real nature makes its presence felt. Perhaps we have been seeking truth all our lives, or else asked to be led to it by some teacher whom we believe to know more than we do. But we shall never succeed in finding what we sought. And now, at this quiet moment, because we are ready for truth, and have transcended that which has hitherto stood between truth and us, truth comes to us uninvited, conferring on us also happiness with its magic touch. It is one thing to meditate in the heart of a wood or alone in one's room, but experience shows that it is quite another to maintain this state of tranquil alertness in the company of one's fellow beings, and it is this that the teachers of the fourth way demand of its followers. Those who pursue this path are not monks or anchorites who have turned their backs on the world, but are quite ordinary men and women who are using in a special way the raw material of life. It is not under the Bodhi tree, but in the mirror of our relationships with others, with people, animals, property, and ideas, that we ordinary people are best able to catch sight of ourselves most clearly. This is difficult work on which those who follow Gurdjieff's teaching are engaged, but it is essential to the attainment of self-knowledge, and if there be more wisdom in any one saying than in another, it lies surely in that old command, know thyself. It was with words of this kind that the study of Gurdjieff's teaching began, and it is with the same words that it ends.